Hey, this is Geoff from IKAWA. I'm here in London at IKAWA HQ.
Hey everyone, this is Miles, also here at London HQ.
And we're just doing a quick preface intro for the lecture or panel discussion we had at SCA Expo in Seattle in April.
Right, so I was the moderator for the panel, and we got to get together some of our favorite roasters and IKAWA users and really get to understand their process in developing profiles and doing a bit of QC as well for their espresso roasting.
Yeah, we've thought with all the amazing advancements that have happened in espresso, the technology's improved amazingly, but espresso roasts don't get talked about maybe enough. So we saw a really great opportunity with the IKAWA roaster where the profiles are shareable and data is directly relatable between different machines to bring together a group of experts and see what they could do. One thing I really loved about this, I personally came away having learned a lot from the panel myself. I contributed a profile, but feel like I came away having learned lots for my next espresso roasting approach.
Definitely. It was really great to hear about there's basically one root profile, and you've got a number of those that are built on top of that once you continue editing and altering that perfect roast.
Yeah, that was what Ben called the evolution of his profile.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was definitely a really great process to see and learn about how what their baseline or their starter profile was for that specific green coffee that they all roasted.
Definitely. And great to see such a turnout. We had about 100 people show up, and we had some really great feedback from them afterwards.
Yeah, and one of my favorite bits out of the whole lecture, obviously getting to really understand the process in creating a profile and being able to tailor something specific to espresso. I was really into the fact that everyone used a fair amount of green metrics and green data. I know that's a bit of a deep dive right into the lecture, but I really appreciated how some of those long-standing QC methods and understanding the green coffee you're working with and how that informs your roasting. It really held up throughout all of the roasters' profiles that were shared.
Yeah, definitely. And it was really interesting to see. In the end, we had 4 very different looking espresso roasts that all tasted really great. Totally different approaches. So it's highlighting something it's really obviously within the espresso, but the approach matters just as much as the execution, I think, too. And I think everybody had a clear idea of what they wanted before roasting, and then used what they knew, used some of that QC you're talking about to develop a process to get the outcome they were looking for.
Definitely, yeah. Time to go to roasting school, y'all.
All right, so everybody had the same coffee for the lecture. It was a washed Colombian coffee from Nariño, supplied by Royal Coffee. So a couple weeks in advance of the lecture, they received that and spent some time with their IKAWA developing the profiles that they brought to this panel. And what's really cool is if you have an IKAWA or the IKAWA Pro app, head to the sidebar menu and you can actually see and download the profiles that our panel brought to the lecture in Seattle. I think we can probably put it back over to the panel and hope everybody enjoys.
Yeah, enjoy, y'all. Roasting for espresso. Bad news, shocker for us here. There's not one best way. But in the session, though, we're going to talk about a few different things around this topic, like looking at what the folks in the industry are doing and different approaches that we have for roasting for espresso. We're going to take a closer look and unpack why, the why behind that, why leading professionals are approaching roasting for espresso, looking at these ways, and it's going to be really great because we have some real tangible examples about that why and about how we're roasting for espresso. And then in regards to future trends, we'll be able to talk about some insights here with our roasting pros and look a little bit more at innovations in roasting for espresso as well. So we'll also get to do a Q&A at the end, so if you've got some burning questions that are building up as we talk through the panel, it'll be, we'll have some time at the end to be able to talk through those. So we've got our panel here of our roasting pros, and we'll start with Ben Put. Actually, we should have, well, we didn't have to sit in this order actually, but Ben Put, he's down at our end here, and Ben is the co-owner of Monogram Coffee, based in Alberta, and in addition to being the co-owner at Monogram, he's a world barista competitor and champion. Has gone to world level with the barista competition from Canada about 3 times now, and is also an IKAWA user and was one of the folks involved in this experiment that we did with roasting for espresso. Next is Jen Apodaca. She is the director of roasting for the Crown at Royal Coffee, and Jen's got about, I want to say, 13 years of roasting under her belt. She has roasted for companies like Intelligentsia and Blue Bottle, and actually does a lot of educational programming at the Crown with Royal. Next up is Geoff Woodley. He's the marketing manager at IKAWA, right over there, second to last. And before coming to IKAWA as our marketing manager, Geoff was the director of coffee for DETOUR Coffee in Canada. And next up, last but not least, is Tony. He is the director of coffee as well at Spyhouse Coffee, and also super experienced roaster, and uses the IKAWA as well at Spyhouse. So just a little bit of background on what we did in preparation for this lecture. We all had a kilo of a washed Colombian coffee. It was a Couture variety from the Nariño region. And this coffee was donated by Royal Coffee, thanks Jen. And what we did was take that coffee and, we had a very open-ended challenge to roast it for espresso. Next, we each shared those roast profiles. We roasted those espresso profiles on an IKAWA sample roaster. We shared those profiles with primarily our filter, Alex, who I'm going to shout out. He's also part of our marketing team, and we all are going to explain each of those different approaches that we had, why we profiled a specific way on the IKAWA sample roaster with the intention and the mindset of using that coffee for espresso. So before we dive into the specific individual profiles that each of our roasting experts here created, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're looking at when we look at these profiles. So the red line up top, data is being collected. So this is our IKAWA, this is the IKAWA Pro app, and basically the data that we're collecting from the roasting chamber, there's a temperature sensor actually collecting that information and plotting it in an XY graph that if a majority of us are roasters here, I'm sure this looks familiar, it's going to be based on the exhaust temperature. So it's helpful to keep that in mind when we're talking about these different roast profiles and how they were designed. Below that, the white line is going to be airflow. And the airflow specific to the roaster that the panelists were using, think of it less as a damper, sort of letting cool air into the roasting environment, and think of it more as actually a fan. So in the roaster, we're using a fan and pushing hot air into the roasting chamber, and we can control how fast or slow that fan is spinning through that airflow line. So that's an illustration of the specific roaster that the panelists were using. To put it into more perspective, so below is the fan I was referring to, the heating element above that, and then the exhaust temperature is being collected by a temperature sensor inside of the roaster. So we're going to dive right in and break down some of these individual profiles that each panelist created, again with the intention of roasting for espresso with the Colombian coffee that we all had. So to dive right in, Ben, I'd really love to hear what your mindset was for this profile.
Yeah, thanks. So the way I sort of approach roasting the IKAWA is, I think one thing that it's really highlighted for me is you roast to your grinder. So basically what I tried to do with this profile was approach it in a way that I knew that I was extracting a certain percentage. And I think you also really roast to your brewing parameters. And I think this is something that isn't often highlighted on bigger roasters because they're harder to recreate execution of stuff. So I think what it's really brought up for me is that I know this profile and how it roasts for both my grinder and for my brew ratio. I think that's been huge. So often when I roast, I'll create profiles of templates that have worked in the past. So the way I did this is I roasted a lot of Colombian samples as sample roasts. And what I initially did is I just focused on the development time to see, like, can I just, when I hit first crack, can I just extend that out a little bit, and will that give me enough development? And usually what happens is as I roast, if the coffee still sort of has too much acidity, I'll start to lengthen the roast to play with Maillard. I think that often, this is another thing that IKAWA I think works really well, because you can look in and actually watch the coffee roast and change. You have a really good sense of how, when you've hit Maillard and how Maillard's sort of developing. So if I've had some espresso roasts where acid isn't a problem, and they'll be a lot shorter than this. I found the Nariño had like lots of nice acidity, but had a lot of acid. The other thing I noticed with this coffee is it had, is it multiple varieties?
I think it's
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a community.
Yeah, so basically I found that some of the coffees cracked at very different points than others. So I tried to come into first crack slower, because my concern was if I had a steep rate after first crack, that some coffees would develop very quickly and some would still be underdeveloped. So I tried to come in soft so all the coffees had a good amount of time to develop but still go through first crack.
Thanks. So I was able to explain specifically the red and yellow lines a few minutes ago. I want to point out another color that we see in this graph, and it's a yellow line of basically what happened in real time with this specific roast that Ben performed on his roaster. Also, he's referring to development in first crack as well, so I think it might be helpful for me to point out that line down towards the end there with the lightning bolt is first crack. So the lightning bolt just below that will have a time stamp for when first crack was marked. And then all the way at the bottom there is DTR, which stands for development time ratio. Basically just taking the time after Ben marked that first crack there in comparison to the entire roast, and having that expressed as a ratio percentage inside of the app. So, Jen.
Yeah.
Curious to hear your process with this espresso roast.
All right. So I just recently got an IKAWA last November, and so I've just been going nuts playing with it with lots of different ways, like playing with airflow, and playing with length of roast, and playing with different lengths of the development stages. I apologize that my voice is a little rough. And so this, I kind of did the same kind of starting point. I had a very successful sample roast that I really, truly enjoy. And I decided to instead play with, I really like lighter roasted espressos. I like them to be sweet, but I really do also like a vibrant acidity. I'm more of the type of espresso fan of more of a long shot. So I roasted for that type of espresso. I decided to shorten my drying stage and move my Maillard time up by 30 seconds compared to my sample roast to give it more time for Maillard to occur. One thing that I also did is my airflow. I've played a lot with the airflow. It's been really, really fun. I've been having like descending airflow. I've had rising airflow. I did this like V format thing. Has been really fun. I've been really liking this one. And then even a flatlined airflow. But in this particular one, I decreased my fan speed about the same time that you will notice that yellowing stage would occur. And at that point, the fan speed, it slows down, so you when you slow the fan speed down, you have the heat that you're able to retain a little bit more heat, but also like potentially you're having I don't know, maybe we're having a little bit of a conduction heat transfer at that moment. I'm not exactly sure if that's truly happening, but I wanted to see if it would work. And then rising towards the end for smoke abatement as well. So this, yeah, I don't know what else. I wanted to keep the same amount of post-crack development time as my typical sample roast, though. I wanted like a really bright acidity, and that most of that comes from the fact that I wanted more of a long shot espresso, which I think that those go really nicely together.
Awesome. Geoff, curious to hear about your profile as well.
All right, so I approached this a little bit differently. I thought it would be interesting to approach this from a perspective of maybe a retail bag being taken home for a home barista or milk drinks. So I approached this to create an espresso that was quite easy to work with, and a little bit lower in acidity, with lots of body, lots of syrupy, sweet, sort of sticky, great base for an easy espresso or a milk drink. There's a significant amount of development on this one. So it's I approached this wanting to make sure that there was it was still retaining the character of this coffee. It's really nice, bright Colombian coffee, but with the goal of reducing the acidity down to a point where it was easy to work with, and at the same time balancing out some of that sweetness and character that's in that coffee naturally. So I spent quite a bit of time in the mired stage with a lot of heat to really try and build some body. And then after first crack, keeping a fair amount of heat on there to, I've found it wasn't just time that after first crack that was relevant to how that coffee tasted. I found actually like a declining or an even return. It's the exhaust temperature sort of flattened out some of the character in the coffee, and I found that actually a gently increasing that exhaust temperature after first crack counterintuitively actually retained more espresso, the acidity and character in the coffee, while balancing out, like I said, some of that acidity length in that time after first crack. So.
Great, thank you, Geoff. Tony. Curious to hear it.
Yep. So for mine, oh my goodness, sorry. Yeah, that's weird. So for mine, I've worked at IKAWA for 2 or 3 years now, and do all my sample roasting on it. So I ultimately looked at the coffee. It was Colombian, it was Merino, it was medium high elevation. It was medium high density. So I treated the same way I treat most of my samples and just ran my sample profile on it. This profile is one that I've adopted initially from the one IKAWA had published by Rob Hoos a couple years ago on their blog, and I worked it. It's kind of a variation of my standard sample profile. Kept it with my team, and we kind of look at the 3 major factors we look at in coffee: total end temp, sweetness, acidity. What flavors are we seeing in this coffee? What do we want to maximize? What do we want to change? We found this coffee had a lot of sweetness, and the acidity was very nice, like poking on that edge of clementine, that like sweet orange, just a little bit of sparkle. So what I did to do that, same way you profile any other coffee, working with your Maillards, your temps, your post-crack development time, knowing how those elements work, treat it the same way. So I wanted a little bit, I wanted to reduce the amount of
like the sugar was just getting a little too bakey, chocolatey kind of stuff. So we rolled up that first crack time to focus specifically on our Maillard. And then we kept our end temp the exact same. We knew that it was about in the area that we wanted, but that whole perceived experience of, like when you add, salt as a flavor enhancer, you add salt to a dish, everything gets better. You add acidity you add lemon juice to a dish, and because you're adding lemon, you're only adjusting acidity, but other flavors taste different. We didn't change our end temp at all. We just played with our sweetness and acidity, and that locked everything and made our perceived end temp kind of lock right in where we wanted to. One thing that I like playing with on the IKAWA, like Jen said, is the airflow, and very similarly, you can see that, I keep turning away from the mic, I'm sorry. You can see that I kind of have that little dip right away, and then I flatline the airflow. One thing I like doing in my roast is working with airflow a lot and using lower airflows in the beginning and the end to allow heat transfer with moisture still in the bean. So I'm trying not to dry it out. The IKAWA being a fluid bed roaster, you will always have fan going. That's what transfers heat. So what I do is get my fan speed up where I want it, and then drop the fan right away. And sometimes if it's a denser coffee needs more energy, I'll actually shake the roaster a little bit to get the fluid bed moving, but I keep it as low as it can go to keep the beans moving, so we're not just like having them sitting on one spot and getting uneven roasts. And that's just been kind of a little trick I learned. So go ahead and take that home with you guys.
Thanks, Tony. I haven't heard of that trick before, but I'm going to give it a try. A few observations on my end just before we dive into more into the specifics of espresso and its relevance as well in roasting. I think it's just an observation. It's kind of fascinating that this is maybe one of the first conversations that I've had with roasters, and I consider y'all some of my close colleagues at this point, and we have these conversations so often, and it's kind of frustrating sometimes because when we talk about roasting, it's so easy to get into that area of, well, you can talk about what you experience and you can talk about it, but there's no way to really know because we're all on a different page. The temp sensors were different, or a different thermocouple, different placement, different size, and different airflow, things like that. But I'm pretty proud that this is finally, one of those discussions where we can all be on the same page. We all use the same green coffee. We really are on the same page with a lot of the variables that we're using to have this conversation. So just wanted to share that as one of my personal observations. I don't know if anyone here has had that same experience with roasting conversations. Sometimes it can be so, you want it to be so productive, but it's hard because we're all working with so many different machines. Other observation that I had is that it's really interesting that a lot of you were saying that you started with sort of a sample roast profile and then built up from there. I'm really, and whoever wants can start with this, but I'm really curious to hear actually about how you kind of stepped to your process from roasting to cupping and then to espresso, or did you skip out on the cupping portion and jump right into tasting the coffee that you roasted in that specific brew method? I feel like a lot of times a lot of things can get lost in translation. I've definitely tasted a coffee that cups really well, but then when we throw it into the grinder and pull it as an espresso, it has a whole other personality.
I did a classic, one of my go-to sample roast profiles for this coffee, just to get a sense of what it tasted like before I profiled it for espresso. And I did cup that out next to some obviously very different looking espresso roasts. But I kind of got a sense of what those coffees tasted like, but I didn't make any final decisions before pulling them for espresso.
For me, A big thing about IKAWA is that if you take good data and save profiles and delete. If you delete the profiles that are bad, I think that's one of the keys. Is it essentially your profiles evolve, and I think that's something really interesting. Is if I go through mine and I look at the first profile I used to the last, they have changed and evolved, and so you sort of go down a path. Like I think if you look at all of these, like it actually is very similar to evolution. They're all very different, and I imagine I'm very curious to try all of them because I imagine they all make good coffee. But I think what's happened is we've all started down a path where we've had, for me, like it is based on a cupping profile, but obviously it's a fair bit longer. And then I have some espresso profiles that are shorter. That I think the big thing is if you are careful with your iterations, your profiles, especially on espresso, will slowly evolve and change. And so for me, this profile slowly got a little bit longer, just so I could get a bit more mired. But I think that's a big thing for me is that they sort of evolve from cupping to something else, based on like you deleting the ones that didn't perform well, and then though it's very much like natural selection for me.
I did four roasts. I did like the one that I said, the sample roast that I really enjoy. I did a colleague's sample roast that's always performed really well. I did a longer roast that was a little bit more developed to accentuate like more of like a really good espresso for maybe like for milk drinks, kind of what you were talking about earlier. And I did one other one. I can't remember exactly what I did, but I tried those four, and I tasted the one that I thought that had the best flavor development, which is the one that I ended up modifying to get what I have now. And that one, although this coffee has like a really wonderful, has a really nice bright acidity, it's really juicy. In that particular roast, I got more toasted marshmallow, like that vanilla, and that's actually one thing that I really, really enjoy in espresso, that sort of perfectly toasted vanilla marshmallow, you know? So knowing that I had that, I was able to go from there, and I cupped again. I also really think that when you cup coffees for, whether you're going to use them for espresso or for filter, you need to have a lot of, not really tackiness for me, but I really enjoy when you can actually, like, it feels like raw sugar, like that you can feel the sugar on your tongue. And I think that means that when you then transfer that roasted coffee to the person who is going to brew it, they have a little bit more to manipulate with their brewing equipment and on the espresso machine. Now, I am not a barista, so I don't know. I mean, I can pull a shot if, like, nobody else is around, you know? I mean, and I know how to clean a machine and I know how to change a group head, but I don't know how to, like, I have never worked at a specialty coffee shop. I worked at a pre-specialty coffee shop, but that was the dark ages. So, so I fortunately have a colleague who helped me pull shots, and she helped me work through, like, knowing what kind of espresso I was trying to go for. And so again, like, my profile really is for that more long shot that I really like. It was really sparkly, but it still had enough, like, toasted brown sugar. So we worked through, like, some recipes that we thought would work really well with this profile. But one other thing I wanted to say is my profile's really short, and I know that it's short. And so one thing I noticed too, Ben, that there was a lot of variance in roast degree, especially if I'm going to have a very short profile. So I just picked out anything that looked, I just did like a pick afterwards. I picked out anything that looked a little underdeveloped or Quaker. So if you roast my profile, you have to do maybe a couple batches and sort through.
Are you saying we need to buy an optical sorter to test out?
There's a little more than just roasting. Yeah.
For me, I really approach this how I would approach it for my cafe purposes. So, you know, we don't often have coffees that are dedicated single origin espressos. We have a coffee that when we have it on the company kit, we have it in brew. This is going to be a great espresso, and you know, espresso is a brew method, and every coffee will shine better on some brew methods than another. Like, it's not a hard black and white statement. You know, if you do an immersion brew of certain coffees, you're going to lose their delicacy. you do large batch brews of a very dynamic coffee, and some of those dynamics get muddled. Do a small batch of a very dynamic coffee, and every cup's different and different. Like, coffees are unique in themselves, but at the end of the day, if we treat coffee like coffee, and kind of see its uniformness in a positive manner, we don't change as much. We try to make our jobs easier, and I try to make my jobs for my baristas easier. So this was, I was looking for something that wouldn't, like, make this coffee the best it would be, but also not an outlier, that it would be uniform, that if I were to pass this across the bar to a barista and say, hey, dial this in for me, they would be able to start with our starting specs and kind of be on spot. Like, I think as an overarching thing as roasters, like, your job will be a lot easier if you try and make the people who serve the end products job easier. You know, if you have really crazy out there specs, like, if your coffee may taste amazing that way, but you have to do a lot of reteaching. And then how do you, like, if you're a wholesaler, in that kind of situation where, how do you sell that to an account? Because they're probably going to treat it the way they treat most other coffees. So, like, yes, we need to advance things, but be true to yourself, develop your signature and do your signature, and consistently do that.
I feel like some people could argue that espresso, you know, when we look back, you know, all the way back to the kind of origin story of the drink, that maybe it wasn't even initially designed to be very tasty. It was definitely a need-based, quick drink, you know, a very quick way and an express way, if you will, to have your coffee or your cup of coffee in the morning or throughout the afternoon. I'm interested to hear from y'all. Why do you think that, as roasters especially, so I know some of us have had, you know, experience being on the barista side of things, but why for us as roasters might it just be relevant to understand how to roast for espresso? And I know the word intention has come up a few times, and we've talked about reverse engineering some things, so starting with the idea of what we want from our espresso and then working back from there. Why would it be relevant for us to understand how to create that end product? It's a big one, it's a thinker. I know.
Like, why delve into espresso?
Why? Yeah.
I think espresso often is the worst drink we serve. I think it's so strong. If the acid is off, it's so sour.
Yeah.
Like, I often think of, like, baristas and roasters. It's like we all drink. It's like the people that drink whiskey, right? Like, they can drink whiskey and it doesn't really affect them, and then you give whiskey to someone that's never had whiskey before, and it's like they hate it. But people like whiskey. But in our industry, sometimes I drink espressos that, like, I can barely stomach, and it's not because, like, anyone's bad at roasting or brewing. It's just because it's so hard. And I think more, to me, like, filter roasting is also very hard, but espresso, like, if it doesn't go well, you're making, like, the strongest, potentially grossest drink that we charge people money for. And even, like, I compare buying an espresso in a shop to, like, buying a lottery ticket. Like, you're spending about the same amount. It's like $2 to $3, and your odds are, you know, 1 in a couple million. And like, I totally understand, and, like, I'm not like throwing shade at anything, but it's just such a hard brew method. Like, if the roast is off, it's going to be really tricky. If the grinder's not behaving, you get sort of one shot at it. You don't get to taste it. Like, if I batch brew, I know what I'm serving. So I just think the reason we need to focus on it is because it is just so stinking hard.
Yeah.
I think I've definitely been discouraged with espresso in the past, like roasting for espresso. And then you do finally hit that roast, you feel like, oh, I've nailed this. And then the interesting thing is, if you go to a wholesale account, you'll see the lineup, and then like 19 out of 20 people are ordering latte to go or something like that as well. So it is I think something we can benefit from paying more attention to and making it better throughout. I'm guilty of, definitely ordering a filter more often than an espresso, and because of exactly what you were saying there. But things like this, I think this really is fascinating. I've learned a lot already today on this, and the more we can dive into the specifics of roasting for espresso, I think the better we can make everybody's experience, from that home barista to a wholesale account or a flagship cafe. Regarding roasting for espresso or for to drink it black or for a milk drink, I think it's even a separate discussion altogether. But
for me, totally echo that thought of espresso is scary, and learning to roast for espresso is very hard because your variables are magnified so much, and what is espresso to one person is not espresso to another person. You come down to filter coffee, and yeah, there's a range in dose a little bit, there's a range in times, but with espresso, we're putting the weight of a kindergartner through a little puck of coffee for 30 seconds. It's so intense. And then, you have your old school espressos, your new school espressos. Espresso can be anything right now. That's the world we're in. So, it's scary. And, if you have a multi-bean blend in espresso, you're saying it's a ratio of 2-to-1 or whatever, but you put in 19 beans in that grinder. It's every shot's not those same 19. So it's hard, it's scary, and that's where kind of echoing what I said before is knowing what you do and how you do it is going to narrow that so much, and understanding that the espresso you may get in the cafes I work in is not going to be the same as you're going to get in Ben's Cafe, or you go to the Crown. We have our different approach and different styles, but we're making our product for that end result. Helps a lot.
Which one should I do? So I'm in the unique position right now because I work for an importer and I teach, and where I have people come up to me, often customers of ours will write to me, and they want to get better at their craft, and where I'm I've worked for a couple companies where when you work for a company, what kind of menu they want, what kind of coffees they buy, what kind of flavors they want to give to their customers, and so as a roaster, your job is to put your ego aside and roast for what roast how you're supposed to. You're supposed to deliver on flavor, the flavors that they want to promote, the flavors they want to sell, the flavors that they have their brand behind. But now, in the capacity that I'm at now, my first question for whoever wants to ask me, how can I get better at what I do, is well, what do you want to do? And I consult and speak with people who roast well after second crack to people who maybe pull even before second crack has happened, So it's a wide range of possibilities, let me tell you. And I haven't even talked about whether they have washed coffees or natural coffees, and what they believe about milk drink building, and there's so many variables. But one thing that has been said to me a lot, which I find really interesting, is that folks who roast light always think that it's so easy to roast dark, and those who, and they're it's so easy to roast dark, you just have to burn the coffee, it's not even a big deal, roasting light is what's really hard. And then I talk to folks who really love dark roasted coffees, And they're like, gosh, it's so easy to be a light roaster. I mean, you just like hear one snip and just pull the coffee out into the cooling tray. I mean, are they even trying, you know? And it's interesting that I can hear it from both sides. And what I can tell you is if you spend a lot of time and if you want to roast, and roasting for espresso, roasting for whatever you are roasting for, is that it's really hard to do all of them. And then if you go into like the different processes of the coffees and different origins, it's even harder, you know? So speaking towards roasting, on the dark side, since I did not give you my dark side roast, I will say one thing specifically about espresso that I think was a misconception when I was a younger roaster was that we would extend development time quite a bit, trying to build more sugar, you know, because we're caramelizing, we're reducing sugars, and we are reducing sugars, but we're also creating a lot of dry distillate flavors. We're also losing a lot of our organic compounds in there. So I would suggest if you are roasting and you want like a darker roast for your espresso, I would suggest no problem, reach that high-end temperature, but maybe even shorten your post-crack development time, because you'll be able to get that caramelization that you're looking for with that final high-end temperature, but you'll also retain a lot of the organic acids that will like also keep that acidity and structure. You'll also be able to yield more after you roast the coffee, and you'll probably be able to use a smaller dose, so you'll save money, but I think it would taste better too. So.
And I want to know your if there was motivation to use a shorter roast.
You only asked me for one profile. I could have given you 3.
Okay. Okay. I just bring it up because it's in terms of just some of this. I'm looking at each of these profiles, and there's a few kind of there's a few differentiating factors with each one. When I look at yours, I see the shorter time, and of course, like in comparison to the longer profiles. Ben, I see your increased airflow, especially at the end of the roast. So when that cooling time has started, Tony, I think one of your standouts of your profile is definitely the way that you've designed the airflow line. And then Geoff, I think for me, it's that your profile has that kind of S shape that we're all really familiar with. I know we can't jump into all of those all at one time, but if each of you had sort of a driving variable that you were adjusting specifically for espresso, whether it be, I feel like we've talked about Maillard a bit, so whether it was manipulating that or really manipulating more so the airflow. I think there's airflow is a really curious, it's an area where a lot of people have questions. So I think if someone had that as a driving factor, I know it's hard to pick one because it's, roasting is working with a lot of variables, putting them together in a way that works specific for that coffee and its intention. But if you, would you say anyone here had really the airflow as one of the primary variables in mind when you were making your profile? I've seen a yes from you, Jen.
I mean, I think I think that's like a primary concern on this roaster.
Yeah.
I mean, it's everything to do with your heat transfer. I mean, if you're talking about a drum machine, then your airflow could be a damper at the back. What you're doing is if by opening your airflow, you are releasing like smoke and chaff, but you're also reducing your heat. So a lot of times, if you roast on a machine like that, then when you increase the airflow, you might even like bump the heat before you increase the airflow to make sure that you have enough heat. If you imagine like opening an oven, and before you open the oven door, all your heat's going to go out of your oven when you're baking those cookies or whatever. So it's kind of like that on a drum roaster, where it's much different here. Here, like, the way the machine works is you set your where you want your temperature to be, and then you're adjusting your fan speed, and the machine will determine how much heat it needs to get to where you want to go based on those 2 parameters. So it's like driving a completely different car and so you have to think about it in those terms. I would say some part of me still thinks about like smoke abatement, because I've been forcing on drum machines for so long. But it might not actually be a very big concern on the IKAWA. So.
Yeah. You say that because of the cyclone.
Because the cyclone's always pulling. You know, I mean, like, you won't. I'm under the impression that your machine will not let us have zero airflow because it'll probably catch on fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly so.
It will go to 60.
Exactly.
Yeah, you
60
can't go
to
to
0.
60.
60 to 100. 60 to 100. Yeah.
So for me, it's that same kind of concept. Like one thing that Miles addressed in the beginning is you only have an exhaust probe on this roaster.
No.
So these curves may look very different than what you've seen in other devices, or it's not that S-shaped curve that we're used to seeing because we're only looking at the exhaust. And like Jen is saying, you're driving. It's like you're driving a different machine, but it's also driving that machine backwards on what you're used to. You're saying, this is how so I'm used to manipulating my gas. If I want my bean temperature to go up, I give it more gas. But this machine, it's all driven off of what the exhaust is determining how to keep an exhaust air line. So if you have a higher differential in your exhaust line, then it's going to pump more heat into it. And the same way with it being fan driving hot air versus fan driving cold air, if you can see in my profile where I have increases, they're working together, because if I'm increasing air and I'm blowing hot air, I'm pushing more energy at the same time. If I go to change the other one and if I keep that constant, I've not only manipulated that factor. These are factors that work together even in a drum roaster. It's less of a factor in a drum roaster because you have more conductive energy and you have direct flame elements as well. But anytime, those two factors are working together at all times in all roasters.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Have you figured out how to max out the heat, like based on like your temperature setting and your fan setting?
For any of those in the back that didn't hear that, Jim was asking if Tony's maxed out the heat before. Is that what it was?
Yeah, based on setting the temperature, based on like the temperature setting, the exhaust setting, and then also the fan setting. Like, if you figured out how to max the heat out.
I have a project to do when I get back.
That'll be the lecture next year.
Yeah.
No, that's just me being like.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No worries. So then, I think it was Tony, you were talking about how you actually kept the same starting and end point with your profile and adjusted basically everything in between with that. I'm curious with, I see with your profile you have the incline, more of a sharp incline happening after a certain period of time. What was your, I'm sure you might touch on this already just a little bit, but I'm curious to know, why that increase at that time, so like much later in the roast?
Yeah, so this profile, which I adopted from another roaster, you can go back and find it on IKAWA's blog. It was designed to replicate the standard SCA cupping profile. Being an air roaster, things are going to move faster. There's just more energy transfer. So the reason why the airflow, the exhaust temperature is so low for so long is I'm trying to extend my drying period as long as possible to kind of get things more into a realm that I'm more familiar with off of I came from a ProMat PRE1 sample roaster. So when I had to switch and buy coffee space on another machine, well, I'm going to make this easy for myself. So using a low temperature, low air speed, I'm trying to retain moisture inside, do energy transfer using water transfers energy better than plant cellular structure. Cellulose doesn't transfer energy while water does. So I'm keeping as much moisture in the bean as long as possible, and being that this is a fan-driven roaster, drying wants to happen faster. You're blowing away the moisture. You put a fan over a puddle, and you put a fan and just a puddle there. The puddle with the fan is going to dry out faster. So that's kind of the point of that. So it's right when I'm coming out of drying. So beans are starting to turn yellow. That's when I ramp the heat up because it's giving off most of its moisture at that point. There's moisture still created through the chemical reactions, but I'm trying to get drying as long as I can to get back into a more normal situation.
And you touched on the topic of moisture briefly. Does anyone here use variables from those any metrics that you're getting from the green coffee specifically? Things like the moisture content or density, water activity. We've seen a lot of different profiles that are based on that. Again, not usually for the context of espresso, but did y'all find that with this coffee, measuring those things helped you create these profiles for the espresso?
Yeah. One of the ways that I adapted it is see that there's 3 points before the end of the roast, and the V, I have the V going down. I have it bottoms out right where Maillard is, or right where yellow stage begins. But I decided to increase the fan speed just before first crack a little bit. And that was because this is a dense coffee, and I know that if I increase the fan speed, that it'll have to kick my heater on harder. And so that way I can give it a little bit more power going through first crack, which will kind of maybe make it crack a little bit closer to each other, because there was some variance.
I didn't use many metrics in terms of measuring, but I think naturally you tend to. This is an aside, but I think it's one of your colleagues, Jen, did a study on water activity versus Maillard. So if anyone's curious on that, I think it was one of the best articles written about it, which is super, super interesting.
Awesome. And where can folks find that?
Is it on your blog?
Yeah, royalcoffee.com. It's on our blog, and you just search up water activity. His name is Chris Kornman. You could also search up. He's written a bunch of stuff about density as well. It's really good stuff.
It was one of the most eye-opening things.
Yeah.
I think we have all used water activity to give us an idea of how long green will last, but the article really dives into how to roast based on water activity, which is super interesting.
So higher water activity, more potential for sugar browning. That's happening during the Maillard stage. So you might see accelerated Maillard on higher water activity coffees.
And I know we've been talking a lot throughout the lecture specific to the IKAWA too, but things like that as well are these are general green and roast concepts as well that exist both with a primarily convective roaster and also roasters with different ratios of convective and conductive heat transfer or direct heat, or with an electric burner or with an atmospheric burner. These are kind of universal ways to approach how you can profile for espresso or otherwise as well.
One change I made coming kind of off the previous question, this was it's a Colombian Nariño, had normal water activity, normal moisture. It's pretty dense coffee. So I knew I had enough cellular material and water still present inside that bean to be able to use a lower heat application. Lower density coffees and coffees with lower moisture, you have to hit them harder. I have to hit them harder. As you can see, there's 4 roasts up here that are all probably very good because I look up to all 3 of you a lot, and this is really intimidating. These are probably all good, so take that as a positive when you go home, that there's a lot of different ways to make good coffee. But if this was a lower density coffee, had lower moisture, the temperature where I do that first bump would be higher. I would be giving the roaster more heat to get into my drying phase, just because there's less material that I want to transfer energy there to do it.
And we're going to be, in a few minutes here, switching into a Q&A. We've slated out a decent amount of time to cover a few questions that anyone here might have for for the panelists. But before we get to that, though, just general, if we can go down the line with general roasting recommendations for espresso. Maybe some of, I think specifically it helps to maybe demystify a little bit that process for folks, and what would be one of the biggest recommendations that you have for anyone here. And another open thinker question.
So I think Jen hit the nail on the head for a lot of it, is that people have sort of glorified first crack quite a bit, and I think it's super important. Like, I'm not saying don't worry about first crack, but people will often only adjust first crack, and I think a part of it is because it's super easy to measure. Like, you hear the coffee crack, you can start timing that, and I think especially for espresso, all the stuff that happens before first crack is super important. I think it was Ben Kaminsky once said that once you see Maillard happen on the coffee, technically it's developing. And I think that is a huge part of figuring out your espressos, is how long is your Maillard time based on that, not just based on first crack. And I think lots of, like, some other roasting companies are starting to focus on that as well. I think the other big one for espresso, so when you cup filter or brew filter, we're all on very similar pages, similar brew ratios. I think the big thing, something good and bad, EK Espresso has allowed us to evaluate coffees very easily and very quickly, but I think they have made it so they don't always transfer well once you put them in a shop. So if you are profiling let's say I'm sitting in a roastery, I have an EK, I have like perfectly formulated water, I'm extracting to 23%, the shots are big, and then suddenly you go to a cafe that's using an old Rober or something and it's pulling 18%, and you don't know why it tastes good, like, you should know. Like, so I think that's the other big thing, is really understand what are your customers pulling your espresso on? Are they using a grinder that's giving them 19%? And if they are, then you should be tasting your coffee at 19%, or working with them to do that. I think that's the big thing about espresso, is that recipe is so key that if you're profiling in an environment that is different than the actual service environment, your profiles will never work.
Thanks, you took both of my points there.
Yeah,
Yeah, you were reading there, yeah. But I'll less on the technical side, but I think for me, I would say that it should be very purposeful. I think it should be a lot of intent with a result when chasing a good espresso, and because we talked about how difficult espresso is. I think that there has to be some versatility in the result. You have to understand that, like, the end result isn't going to be the same every time. We want it to be, but as Ben said, the grinders are going to be different, the environments are different, the water's going to be different, and creating an espresso roast in a very, like, confined environment where there's only one grinder or one person developing that is not going to give you a result that's maybe going to work as well for everybody as one that you test in different environments, have different people using it. Only cupping espresso roasts, I think, is challenging. I think pulling it on different machines and making sure that if the intent is to wholesale or to sell this coffee, then it should work well for as many people as possible.
I'm not really sure what I should say. I overall in roasting, which is probably the only advice I can give, is just always remember that time, as well as temperature, is affecting your coffee. Like, the longer the times are, your coffee is going to be losing the organic compounds because it's the longer exposure to heat. If you want to have a really, like, high acidity coffee, then find a way to extend your Maillard time so that you can create more aromatics and development time before that. But and if you want a longer post-crack development time and you want more time for the caramelization to occur, even like shortening your Maillard, because they both kind of go hand in hand. You can't really like lengthen one without lengthening your total roast time. So like if you're going to lengthen your drying stage, then you have to also it's going to affect how long everything else is. So all three of those stages, drying stage, Maillard stage, and your post-crack development time, they all play together. It's more of like I have a 12-minute roast, and where am I going to move my sliders? You can't just, if you lengthen one, then next thing you know, you have a 14, 15-minute roast, and it's going to dramatically affect the flavor of your coffee.
Patience is one of the easy things with profiling for filter is you can turn around in a couple days and make your change. Espresso tends to need, often in classic forms, gets a little bit more rest to let some of the gases come off and stuff. And it can be really hard as a roaster to, after you've done those first few batches, you got a good idea of what's going on, to have to wait that time period to, like, you're going to want to do what you feel like you should do, but then it takes a lot of data tracking and stuff to remember what, you can't not make a change for maybe, the 10-day cycle that you may run on for your normal espresso. If you know something needs to change, but then you have to evaluate that first one based on what you did the first time, not what you're doing right now, because you may have made changes, and that's hard. Write down as much stuff, because you think you may remember, but you're not going to remember. Someone's going to ask you another question in the middle of you doing that batch, and you're going to get flustered, and stuff happens. Record everything. And then, like Jen has been saying, profiling is profiling, and know how to profile. The skills for profiling espresso, there's that little bit further removed that we all talked about with recipe and everything, but if you know how to adjust sweetness, if you know how to adjust acidity, if you know how to adjust roast level, you know how to adjust Maillard's, drying times, post-crack development, those factors transfer. The one thing that I always try to push people is coffee science is science. Coffee is a plant, and when it's roasting, it's a heat application. Plants should behave like plants. Food should behave like food, and we mystify a lot of this, and we come up with theories that don't align with other, watch cooking shows, talk to chefs, see how they do things to get the same results, because we're all dealing with organic matter and flavor compounds.
Yeah, I took a few one-word takeaways from all of your answers, and I think some big things to remember in the overall roasting for espresso process would be data, like you're mentioning, whether it's digital or manual. Capture data, take notes that you can refer to later, be patient, modulation, little things in the roast. Again, we were talking about first crack a lot, but there's a lot of other things involved in that process that are really important milestones and things to take note of. Intention was one I wrote, and then communication as well. I think collaboration could kind of be under or related to that communication topic, but I think we covered a lot of ground, and it was really great that we actually had some profiles to refer to with each of our individual processes. Want to open it up a little bit, and if anyone here has any questions or just generally wants to share their experience with roasting for espresso, or found that anything that we were talking about resonated, please feel free to share.
So I'm actually fairly new to roasting, and I was just wondering what you guys thought about the pros and cons of multiple bean blend versus just making espresso from a single order.
Great question.
Blends are great. I'm a fan of blends. I'm blend positive. I did not create that as such a cool word, though, but I got it from those guys at Modern Times, so I give them credit. But I would just say be wary of your blend components. If you're creating a flagship blend, then it needs to be consistent year-round, or you need to maybe address having seasonal blends. Make sure that not every coffee that you put in your blend is going to be available at its prime flavor year-round. You may have to change every 6 months or 3 months. So make sure that your flavor profile that you're trying to create is a sustainable flavor that you can create year-round. That's my advice. And then also, I would recommend not getting too crazy. Like I personally wouldn't do more than a 5-bean blend. If you're doing something for like large batch brew and you're putting in like 90 grams or 200 grams in for a big batch brew, then there's a really good possibility that your blend percentage ratio will be the same in that big batch brew, but maybe not in a portafilter when you're doing 17 grams. So it's like 17 grams is like, I counted it out with like 3 or 4 different types of coffees, but dark roasted, light roasted, and Ethiopians, I like wanted to know, but it's like 130 beans. So if you have like a 7-bean blend, like you might not have consistent shots. That's what by math, I would say that that's probably true. But from experience, I think these guys might know better.
Probability is probability.
What are your feelings on post versus pre-blending when you're roasting?
Like post-roast and pre-roast blending. I think the big thing is when you're doing a blend, you have to make sure that you're matching solubilities across the coffees, because you're going to put all that coffee is going to get ground at the same grind setting, and it's also going to get brewed at the same brew ratio, unless something really weird happened. So I think that's a big thing. I think it's, if you were going to do pre-roast blending, you would have to make sure you're very similar solubility coffees. I think the advantage of blending afterwards is you can roast to the correct solubility. I think that's huge. You want to make sure that when you're pulling espressos that are blends, that they're both extracting at percentages that you feel are making the coffee sing, and that will also allow you to go back and adjust those roasts accordingly. And I also think it's important to taste the components separately.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Oh, I think great.
Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that you can do both, and I think that both are really hard. Okay, it can be really easy to do post blending, but you can actually, and you have to work really, really hard at it. You have to completely change your profiles. If you're going to try and pre-blend, it is accomplishable. I mean, but it's really hard. And you need to be honest and have like a really good blind panel to make sure that you're creating the same, that they can't tell which one is which. So just be honest and like let people give you the criticism, but you have to do a lot of hard work to get there. Okay, so it is possible. You should do what you think is best. I mean, coffee's roasted different ways. So some coffees with certain heat application will roast quicker than others. With solubility, this is where the one thing that I think is kind of weird, because and from my perspective, and not like darker roasted coffees or coffees that have had longer time in the machine, usually have like a lower TDS. They probably also need more. So you need to dose higher if you're trying to accomplish a certain extraction percentage. So if you're gonna post blend and you have like a dark, a medium, and a light, then that's why blend ratio is super important. That's why actually like your light, you'll actually have a smaller percentage than your darker roasted base where you have like a higher percentage, if that makes sense. That way you're getting the proper extraction of each of those. So what I think is a great thing to do is if you have multiple blends in your post blending because you want them to be roasted at different levels, then I would recommend pulling shots of them as components to see how they extract. Thank you, and then go using that data in order to get a more cohesive blend based on their how much you add of each component.
I do both depending on the context, to be honest. For me, part of the initial thing was scale. If you're doing, even at a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio on a 3-blend, just example, if you have an order come through for 35 pounds of coffee and your roaster outputs 30 pounds, you have a lot of coffee. And like, this is a business. You know, you gotta, if you have the means where you can, you know, balance that flux, great. If you don't, then you don't. And for me, it was something I did, and I, you know, for multiple reasons, but one of the things that gave me the confidence in doing it was that product is going to be ground together. It's going to be served together. I'm going to evaluate it and roasting together. When I was learning to roast, it was before we were really talking about solubility, and the reason people talked about post-roast blends was maximizing each individual component. That's not the point of a blend. The point of a blend is to have a cohesive whole, and if you're maximizing all of the flavors of all of these, they're not going to be cohesive. The acidity of one might clash with the other. That in a way could work better being treated uniformly. The other challenge with it is to get solubility has to do with how long you're in a lot of the phases of roast, and if you can, and coffees, you know, behave differently. They go through their different phases at different times. But there is research being done by a few people that's showing if we extend out the drying time, we're actually make it so that all the beans in those pre-roast blends go through those phases much more uniformly. So you do get similar end results.
Yeah. I'll just quickly add, I think some of my favorite espressos, not all of them, but a lot of them have been blends, and I think they have the potential to be really versatile and complex, but I think they're also some of them are challenging to do well because of all these things. So it can, because they're sort of seen as a staple, they can sometimes be maybe less efforts put into developing them sometimes, and it's easy to just, because they're always there, to forget to check back in on them. But I think that a good blend requires constant evaluation and feedback and iterations as coffees change. But also they can be really great, and a good blend, I think, will, as coffees rest, will behave differently and taste a little bit differently. And a good blend can also kind of rest on each other and extend the sort of sweet spot for when that espresso is really good. So you can have two coffees sort of morphing together as they rest and bringing that sweet spot out a little bit further and sort of making it easier for baristas or home users, whoever's pulling that shot, to get a good shot over different dates that espresso roast.
Sounds like you can almost split the answer into like sensory and QC considerations, and then also business and considerations. Yeah.
We've done both in the same blend, where we took two components and roasted them together, but we wanted to keep the high component that was only like 15%, that was also offered as a single origin, and we wanted the maximum acidity and floral notes in that coffee. So that one, so it was kind of a little bit of both. Post pre-blend, pre-post blend.
We've got one back here.
A mashup.
Yeah, I'm curious how you all would approach translating these profiles into a production setting, given how different these curves are from a typical production curve, and then also anything that you can say about how much time you are spending in drying versus Maillard versus development for these specific roasts.
Hot topic. Well, we can move through this one. This one is probably going to be one we have to move a little bit more quickly through. But something tells me there might be some post-lecture conversation. So if y'all are okay with that, some people can ask questions depending on each person's individual schedule here. So.
I can speak really quickly to it. I think a lot of people want to be able to take a sample roast and easily apply it to larger production. And I am of the opinion that this only kind of works. To me, the way it works is comparatively within coffee. So if I know that I roasted this Colombian and the profile worked this way, and then I roasted another Colombian and it required more development time or dried differently, it's probably going to do that on a larger scale as well. So I've done that before, where I can say, oh, this coffee did need more heat in the IKAWA. It's probably going to need more heat on our larger roaster. I'm of the opinion that the IKAWA captures a lot of data, but if you think about how much is chemically happening in a roaster, roasters capture a very small amount of data. So I think the ability to transfer them is difficult. I do more as comparative.
I think it depends on what you're trying to transfer it to, you know? Yeah. Like upstairs in the roaster village, like I have like my IKAWA roast that was successful, and then I do it on the Probatino. Like it's a 1 kilo, so it's going to be pretty similar. It's going to be a little longer because it's a little bit larger machine doing a larger batch, which is normal, right? You know, like you're roasting on 70 kilo or 120 kilo. Your roast times are probably a bit longer than somebody roasting on a 12 kilo or a 5 kilo, right? And that makes sense because there's a whole lot more that you're roasting, and it takes so much more thermal energy to produce. So, but going from the IKAWA is interesting to me because if you're trying to translate it to go to a Probat, that's one thing. If you're trying to translate it to go to a Loring, that's probably easier actually. Trying to translate it to go to a Diedrich, that's also very different. All of these things have, all of these different types of roasters have different types of heat transfer, different types of manipulations that are possible and not possible. So one thing that I noticed on the IKAWA, just very shortly, I've just been playing with it, and I still feel like I need to do it a little bit more to see if I have anything conclusive, but playing a lot with the airflow, you can really move around when you want first crack to happen. So a lot of air roasters, first crack happens very late, like 400 degrees Fahrenheit, or like 200 Celsius, but on a drum machine, you might be looking, depending on your probe placement, of course, right? You could be looking at anywhere between like 380 or 390 for first crack, maybe even 395, so much lower. So there's ways that you can do it to mimic when first crack happens, so then you can kind of look at like maybe stages of the roast and then trying to translate that, but that's kind of really the first step, and allow that, and it's not going to be conclusive with every coffee, and just let yourself be wrong and say like, okay, well that didn't work, let's try something new, you know.
So another takeaway for everyone here, we actually, anyone can head to the App Store, be able to download the IKAWA Pro app and be able to try out these profiles for yourself. And if you do have any questions for me specifically as someone that is based here in the States with IKAWA, please feel free to let me know. And then if you have any espresso questions as well, you guys can come and chat up the panelists here. Just please, there's some evaluations on your chair. If y'all can fill those out, it would be much appreciated. And thank you for attending our Roasting for Espresso lecture. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Tony is going to be one of our guest roasters at the IKAWA booth as well, so he's going to be there from 1 to 3, so if you have some questions, that's another great venue for that.
I actually brought the rest of the coffee.